The courtroom was silent, so silent you could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights. A young black boy, no older than 8, stood in front of the judge. His small hands trembled, but his eyes didn't. They burned with something stronger than fear. Behind him, his mother stood in shackles, her wrists chained, her orange jumpsuit dull under the courtroom lights. The audience whispered, half in curiosity, half in disbelief. Moments earlier, that same boy had looked up at the judge and said something no one in that room would ever forget. "Let go of my mom, and I'll make you stand." The judge, a stern woman in a wheelchair, froze. Then, soft laughter echoed through the courtroom. From the benches, from the lawyers, even from the guards. They thought it was just a child's desperate outburst, but something about the way he said it felt different. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried the weight of truth, the kind that makes people uncomfortable. Outside, reporters waited, cameras ready to twist another story about justice served. Inside, the boy's eyes stayed locked on the judge. There was pain in them, but also a strange kind of calm, as if he knew something everyone else didn't. Something that would soon turn the entire courtroom upside down. They didn't know that within minutes, everything, every bias, every whispered insult, every look of superiority would be tested. Because this wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning. The question wasn't whether his mother was guilty. The question was how far people would go to keep their illusion of justice alive, even if it meant destroying a child's world in the process. And as the gavel was about to drop, the impossible happened. What that little boy did next would silence every laugh in that room and make the entire nation question what justice really means. This is the story of a boy who challenged the system, not with anger, not with power, but with something far more dangerous: truth. Would you have believed him if you were there? Before that fateful day in court, their lives were simple, quiet, even forgotten by most. The boy's name was Malik, and his world was small but full of meaning. Every morning he'd walk his little sister to the bus stop, holding her hand like a guardian. Their neighborhood wasn't rich, but it was alive with sounds. Old radios playing gospel from cracked windows, the hum of the ice cream truck, and the familiar laughter of kids chasing dreams that didn't cost anything yet. Malik lived with his mother, Danielle, in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. She worked double shifts at a nursing home, caring for strangers who rarely remembered her name. Her hands were always tired, her back always sore, but she never complained. To Malik, she was unstoppable, a force that carried love in every word, warmth in every meal, and strength in every breath. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. On weekends, she'd braid his sister's hair while Malik read his favorite science books aloud, pretending he was a teacher. He dreamed of building machines one day, ones that could help people walk, heal, or move again. Danielle would smile and tell him, "Baby, the world needs builders more than breakers." But the world didn't always see builders when it looked at them. At the grocery store, people clutched their bags a little tighter. In the park, parents called their kids away when Malik came too close. His mother would just whisper, "Keep walking, son. They don't know your worth." And so he learned to carry his silence like armor, until one night changed everything. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that drowns out thoughts. Danielle was on her way home from work when police lights flashed in her rearview mirror. A routine stop, they said, a broken taillight. But within minutes, everything turned wrong. No one saw the moment her calm voice turned to fear. No one heard her say, "Please, my kids are waiting for me." All the world saw later was a viral video, 30 seconds long, edited, narrated, twisted. The headlines didn't mention her name, just her color. The next morning, Malik woke to the sound of pounding on the door. Officers filled their apartment, searching, shouting, not explaining. His sister cried while Malik stood frozen, watching as they took his mother away in handcuffs. They said it was theft, fraud, resistance. He didn't understand the words. He just saw his mother disappear behind the flashing lights. Days turned into weeks, the neighborhood whispered. Friends stopped coming over. Even at school, teachers avoided his eyes. He heard the word criminal spoken too easily, too confidently. as if a single accusation erased an entire life of sacrifice. But Malik didn't cry. He waited. He believed the truth would come out. That's what his mother always said. Truth never hides forever. When the trial finally came, he sat in the courtroom in his best clothes, shoes polished until they reflected his face. He looked at the people around him, all dressed in black suits, their eyes sharp like they'd already decided the ending. The prosecutor spoke of evidence, of numbers, of patterns. They spoke like they were describing a stranger, not his mother. Danielle sat still, her head held high, her wrists heavy with cold steel. She didn't plead. She didn't beg. She just looked at her son and smiled. The kind of smile that says, "Be strong, baby. Don't let them see you break." The judge presiding over the case was known for her firmness, Judge Eleanor Watts. Paralyzed years ago in an accident, she now ruled from her wheelchair. People called her fair, others called her unyielding. She believed in the law. But sometimes the law forgot who it was supposed to protect. In the courtroom's polished silence, Malik's presence felt almost invisible. A small boy in a world built for power. But his eyes never left the judge. Something in her expression, distant, conflicted, maybe even guilty, pulled his attention. He noticed how she hesitated each time she looked at his mother, how her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her notes. And deep down, something inside him whispered that this wasn't just another case. It was a reflection of something bigger, a pattern that stretched beyond those courtroom walls. Outside, protesters began to gather. Some held signs demanding justice. Others shouted that she deserved punishment. News vans lined the street, their cameras pointed like weapons. The tension thickened by the day. Reporters didn't care about the truth. They wanted a story. Politicians wanted a symbol. And in between it all, Malik just wanted his mom back. He started bringing a small notebook to court every day, sketching things he noticed, the way people looked away when the defense spoke, the subtle nods exchanged between the jurors, the tiredness in the judge's eyes. He didn't understand the system, but he could see the patterns forming, like equations waiting to be solved. And then one night, while reviewing old court videos online, Malik found something strange, something that shouldn't have been possible. A discrepancy, a contradiction, something hidden in plain sight. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny discovery would set off a chain of events that would shake the courtroom to its core. The next morning, he stood before the judge, small, silent, uninvited. The bailiff tried to move him, but the boy didn't flinch. He looked straight at the woman in the wheelchair and said with quiet defiance, "Let go of my mom, and I'll make you stand," the courtroom gasped. Some laughed. Others scoffed, but Malik wasn't joking. He had seen something. Something that could expose everything the system tried to hide. The moment that would change all their lives had just begun, and though no one believed him, yet the balance of power in that courtroom was about to shift in ways no one could have predicted, because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that shakes the world. The laughter in the courtroom did not leave when the sound stopped. It drifted like a stain that clung to fabric. It followed Malik through the metal detectors, into the echoing hallway, down the courthouse steps slick with yesterday's rain. It perched on the news vans and rode home on the bus beside him. It lay across his pillow and returned again in the morning when the doors opened and the same faces filed into the same seats. The laughter was a verdict announced before the verdict, a permission slip for disbelief. He carried something heavier than that sound. It was a shape forming inside him, the same shape he knew from math problems and machines, lines aligning, pieces locking, only this time it wasn't numbers. It was a pattern of people, where eyes landed, where heads shook, where pens moved when a certain word was spoken, where fear lived and where it pretended not to. He watched the gallery. The men in dark suits always sat together, a row of certainty. Near the aisle, a woman took notes without ever looking toward Danielle. On the back bench, a cluster of spectators leaned forward only when the prosecutor spoke about records and risk. Malik tracked each glance, each smirk, each shallow breath when the chains at his mother's wrists jingled against the wooden table. He wrote these tiny moments into the margins of a small notebook already crowded with arrows and times and names. The story outside was simpler than the one inside. Screens called it a case about money, a missing sum, a signature that didn't belong. A work ID used when Danielle had been on a bus heading home. The footage they aired always ended the same way, with blue lights and a headline big enough to drown a person. Her years of caregiving, her quiet mornings, the way she saved every receipt and taped permission slips to the fridge, none of it fit into a chyron. The city preferred a shape it already recognized. What he had found the night before sat like a spark under his tongue. A discrepancy, yes, but also a door. In one body cam clip, an officer announced the time out loud while his dash display showed a different minute. In another, the timestamp rolled backward for 2 frames and corrected itself. In the payroll ledger, a supervisor's approval block appeared twice with matching pixels, as if pasted. In a courthouse hallway security video, a man whose badge read maintenance pushed a cart past the clerk's office 3 times in 7 minutes, each pass with the same cup tilted at the same angle. The kind of repetition that feels like déjà vu until you measure it. And there, in a news segment replay, the audio carried a background tone he recognized from a different room, a humming fluorescent that belonged not to the precinct but to the courthouse basement. The puzzle was not elegant. It was jagged, but it pointed in one direction. Stories were being assembled from parts that did not belong together. He moved like a shadow through the days that followed. Quiet enough to be ignored, small enough to pass under things, relentless enough to leave marks where adults had not thought to look. He traced paper trails back to a vendor that billed the nursing home for a replacement time clock 2 days after Danielle's arrest. He made a map of badge pings from a list accidentally flashed on a paralegal's laptop when she stood to plug in a charger. He watched which doors opened with laughter and which opened with keys. The courtroom listened to polished language about precedent and probability. Malik listened to the sounds that broke through the polish. The turning of a wheelchair's rim, the catch in Judge Watts's breath when the prosecutor presented the state's chart, a framed image with boxes and arrows that pointed to guilt, the slow rub of the bailiff's thumb along the edge of his radio, the indistinct murmur that always rose when the public defender finished, a sound not of disagreement but of dismissal. He learned the judge's rhythms, too. Hands folded on the desk before tough rulings, eyes closing for a fraction when something struck a nerve, a ritual straightening of papers before recess. She carried her history the way others carried their robes. The city held her up as a symbol, the woman who returned to the bench after her spine shattered, who refused pity, who never raised her voice. A mural downtown showed her beside a set of scales, the wheelchair rendered like a throne. People loved the story because it demanded nothing from them. It turned struggle into pageantry and called it inspiration. Malik did not want a mural. He wanted his mother home. On a gray Wednesday, the hearing stretched into evening. The prosecutor unveiled a chart with Danielle's name at the center and thicker lines whenever the voice said the word network, as if adding ink made added meaning. Malik looked at the jurors and saw how power travels, not as force, but as framing. It made complexity feel simple. It made doubt feel like weakness. He felt the pressure to accept their constellation just to stop the room from looking at him like he was naive. He looked down at his own notebook and drew another shape in the margin, a set of wheels beneath a bench, a pair of hands on metal rims, a spine braced by habit and resolve. He drew lines from that bench to the clerk's desk, to the witness chair, to the screen that displayed the clips. Then he drew tiny circles where cables disappeared through floor ducts and where the maintenance cart always lingered. During a recess, the hallway filled with commentary disguised as concern. He watched a reporter rehearse lines into a phone with a face wet from rain, the word accountability repeated like a drumbeat. Accountability meant something different for people like Danielle. It meant carrying a weight that others had placed and being told not to complain about its shape. In the days that followed, he woke early to ride buses to places he had never been, back entrances, service corridors, loading docks. He learned the smell of the courthouse basement, dust, coffee, the sweet tang of floor polish. He learned the hum of the generator during storms and the way fluorescent lights flickered when a compressor kicked on. He counted steps between doors and found that the maintenance corridor behind the clerk's office connected not to the main elevator, as signs said, but to a freight lift that opened into a storage room where duplicate evidence boxes sat in neat rows. The labels were correct. The staples looked tight. But one lid bore a tiny crease where a hand once pressed down in haste. He lacked access. He had time. He noticed the judge arriving before dawn one morning, a silhouette scissored from darkness, her wheels whispering along the smooth ramp. A driver closed the car door and stood back until she nodded. She moved with care, but not as a person accustomed to help. She kept distance between herself and every outstretched hand. She had built an island and lived on it. He stood hidden in the shadow of a column and wondered at the sentence he had thrown into the room 2 days earlier. He had said he could make her stand. The words had felt like truth when they rose, and afterward they felt like fate calling his bluff. Yet they had not been a bluff. A different kind of plan had been assembling in him for years. Each time he set a textbook on the table and sketched a machine. All his small sketches of knee joints and pulley angles, all his fascination with torque and balance, all his mother's late-night stories about residents who smiled for the first time after physical therapy, these pieces were not separate anymore. They nested inside the larger pattern of a city deciding who mattered. He did not need miracles. He needed leverage. He started building after school in a corner of the apartment that had been a dining space once. He had scavenged aluminum rods from a furniture pile on the curb and bought webbing with saved coins. He scavenged springs from a broken trampoline behind the complex. He watched videos of prototypes that let paraplegic patients bear weight for brief moments with locked knees and braced hips. He did the math with a pencil chewed down to wood. He knew a boy could not wheel a device through a metal detector and past armed officers. But he also knew there were other ways to bring a machine into a room that believed it had seen every trick already. While the device took shape, the case twisted tight. The prosecutor's witnesses stacked on one another like crates. A supervisor from the nursing home spoke about irregularities in schedules. An auditor spoke about policy. A detective spoke about motive the way one names weather. None spoke about Danielle as a person. The defense tried to lift her from the script. Years of caregiving, overtime logged, residents who reached for her hand, but significance shrank beside the chart on the screen. The jury stared at the boxes as if learning an alphabet. Malik kept eating his fear in small bites, swallowing without tasting. He missed his sister's bedtime story 2 nights in a row while the city debated Mercy on television. Mercy became a performance for those who already had safety. For those without it, Mercy was a rumor. On Friday, he noticed that the maintenance cart remained parked outside the evidence room longer than usual. The cup with the tilted lid was gone. The man who pushed the cart wore the same shirt, the same badge, but his shoes were new and his back straightened when a certain officer walked by. The officer touched the cart handle casually, like a person greeting a dog. The gesture looked like nothing if you wanted it to be nothing. It looked like a spark if you had seen too many small flames ignored. He went home and drew the cart. He drew the lid that had disappeared. He measured the mouth of the cup and found it matched the diameter of a small camera lens he had once seen at the electronics stall near the bus stop. He didn't know whether a lens had been hidden there or a listening device or something else he didn't have a name for. He knew only that stories were being gathered not just by witnesses but by watchers, and the watchers were closer to the evidence than anyone admitted. He rewatched the arrest footage with the hum of the courthouse basement in his head. He isolated the sound and compared it to a recording he had made the day he waited by the service corridor. The waveforms resembled cousins. Not a perfect match, but closer than strangers should be. In one body cam clip, a faint echo preceded a door slam by just enough to suggest a different room. Lives were being cut and spliced as shamelessly as the news packages pretending to be neutral. The next morning, he noticed the judge's hands trembling more than usual. The gavel struck with the same measured control, but the fingers around it were not calm. Exhaustion? Doubt? The weight of a city's eyes? He could not know. He could only feel something shifting under the veneer. He placed his device into a soft bag that had once carried groceries and slipped it beneath the bed. He practiced assembling it in the dark. He practiced folding it until it looked like a bundle of textbooks. He imagined the path from the courthouse entrance to the side door of the chapel, where families sometimes waited for privacy and grief. He imagined the back corridor he had mapped, the one that led to the staging room for jurors, the one with the heavy door that needed only a shoulder and timing when a bailiff turned his head. He imagined the moment he would wheel it into the light and risk everything on one gamble, that a woman who did not trust hands might trust a truth revealed through action. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew. The signs sharpened. Some faces came to watch, not to care. They wanted a glimpse of spectacle, the televised kind that kept ratings high and conscience low. He moved through them unseen. The smallest person in a crowd becomes its best witness. He noticed the public defender's eyes, rimmed red, lingering on Danielle with a look that swung between apology and resolve. He noticed the prosecutor's hair immaculate even after long days, the blade-edge creases of a person who slept without second thoughts. He noticed Judge Watts rubbing the rim of her wheel when she thought no one watched. He noticed her pausing before saying the word intent, as if the word itself carried a shadow. He kept writing, chains, wheels, breath, light, hum, he. Wrote them in different orders like a child rearranging blocks to see which stacked, fell, and which held. The hearing reached a day marked on the calendar as decisive. The prosecutor announced new evidence, a ledger update and a video angle not previously shown. The gallery leaned forward in unison, a wave of hunger. The screen displayed Danielle at a time she was supposed to be home. The timestamp felt like a gavel. The prosecutor's words felt like closure. But Malik's body reacted before his mind did. His skin prickled. His fingers tightened around the pencil until wood creaked. The audio track carried that same basement hum again, only this time layered with an almost inaudible beep, repeating every 30 seconds, the sound a freight elevator made when a door stayed open too long. He had stood beside that elevator. He knew the beep. He looked to the maintenance corridor door, closed, to the clerk's office, calm, to the jurors, spellbound. He looked to Judge Watts. Her eyes narrowed a fraction, the motion of someone trying to hear a memory. She knew buildings, he realized. She had learned every route after the accident, had measured every incline with her body, had mapped survival through architecture. She hears what others do not. She hears the building breathing. Their eyes met. It lasted a heartbeat and a lifetime. Something moved behind her practiced calm, recognition, curiosity, a sliver of fear large enough to be hope. He returned home that night and did not sleep. He measured his device again. He tightened hinges and restitched straps. He tested the locking joint that would hold weight for only a few seconds at a time. He whispered nothing to the room and listened to silence answer. He pictured Danielle in the witness chair. He pictured the judge's fingers on the rim of her wheel. He pictured a city that believed standing meant power and seated meant pity. He pictured transforming that assumption into a question so loud it would deafen the laughter that had followed him for days. The next day, a storm rolled in and the courthouse lights flickered. Power slid to the backup generator with a groan. Proceedings paused while sound settled. In the murk of uncertainty, Malik slipped along the route he had memorized, past the chapel where a woman prayed into her sleeve, through the service corridor where the floor smelled like lemon, into the small staging room where jurors once ate stale crackers. He unfolded his device with the speed of a magician half terrified of being caught. He covered it with a coat and propped it beside a door. When he stepped back into the hallway, an officer rounded the corner. The officer's gaze passed over him the way people look through glass. The safety of invisibility burned and saved in the same breath. He kept moving, small, steady, certain. In the courtroom, the storm pressed its weight against the windows. The audience arrived late and restless. The prosecutor wore a look that said timing belonged to him. Danielle entered, chains whispering. The judge rolled in, jaw set. The hearing resumed under the dim throb of emergency lights. If truth had a sound, today it was the hum of a building trying to hold. The prosecutor primed the room with words like new development and final clarity. The screen fed the hum again. The beep again. The clerk adjusted volume. A few heads tilted, hearing nothing wrong. The gavel touched wood, a warning without sound. The judge's hand trembled once and stilled. Malik felt the moment open like a fault line. He moved toward the aisle. At the same instant, the maintenance cart appeared at the back wall. The cart paused. The officer, with the familiar touch, leaned against the frame, eyes drifting, a portrait of boredom. "Nothing to see," said his posture. "Everything to see," answered Malik's spine. He breathed in the scent of wet coats and old varnish and fear. He thought of his mother braiding his sister's hair, of gospel from windows on quiet Sundays, of the way a city can decide it knows you before you say your name. He thought of the device waiting like a held breath behind a door 1 corridor away. He took a step. A bailiff shifted as if on cue. A palm rose in warning. The judge looked up, the slightest change, a pebble starting an avalanche. The gallery rustled. The storm rattled a pane. Power stuttered and returned in a blink that moved through the room like a shiver. He did not stop. Not because he believed he could not be stopped, but because he believed the pause would become consent if he allowed it. He crossed the threshold of acceptable behavior and entered the space reserved for authority. And for a single suspended second, the city held him in its open mouth, unsure whether to swallow or spit him out. Everything he had built waited in the shadows of his plan. Everything the state had built towered in the open. Between them lay a woman with chains, and a judge with wheels, and a room trained to laugh at possibilities it had not authored. The bailiff moved. The officer at the wall stood straighter. The maintenance cart rolled an inch. The hum sang louder under the storm. Malik reached the bar and rested his hand on the gleaming wood that had kept him small. He lifted his chin without words, without plea, with only the certainty that some truths must be performed to be believed. The judge's fingers tightened on the rim. The gallery inhaled. The screen froze mid-frame, and in the breath before the room chose its next shape, the door to the side corridor eased open behind the witness stand, just enough for a coat-covered bundle to be visible to a single pair of practiced eyes, the eyes of a woman who knew buildings, who knew ramps and thresholds and leverage, who recognized a device assembled by a child who had studied her movements as carefully as others studied the law. The balance shifted. Gravity felt different. The gavel hovered. Then the maintenance cart's wheel snagged on a seam in the floor, the kind of small catch no one notices until it isn't small anymore, the kind that slows a routine and exposes the routine as choreography. Something was about to break. Maybe a cover, maybe a pattern. Maybe the arrogance that had made people laugh at a promise formed from love and mathematics. The storm pounded the glass. The lights trembled. The room leaned toward a single point where a boy and a judge, 2 lives measured by different weights, recognized that the next seconds would decide not only a verdict, but whether a city could ever again pretend not to hear its own hum. And just as the first shout began to rise from the far bench, the building itself held its breath. The room stood on the edge of chaos, every breath trembling, every heartbeat counting down to something no one could yet name. The rain outside had become a roar, pressing its fists against the tall courthouse windows. The storm had taken its seat among the spectators. Malik stood at the bar, small and still, as if gravity had chosen him as its anchor. The judge's gavel hung in midair. The maintenance cart at the back remained caught on a seam in the floor, motionless now but heavy with meaning. The gallery, full of eyes that had laughed before, watched as silence thickened into something physical, like smoke no one could breathe through. Then, without permission or warning, the lights flickered again, a pulse of darkness, a heartbeat of confusion, and in that heartbeat, Malik moved. He slipped behind the wooden rail, his steps precise, fearless. The bailiff shouted, words lost to thunder, but the judge's hand lifted, halting him. She didn't know why. Something in her bones told her this wasn't defiance. It was destiny unfolding. Malik reached the witness stand, the same place where his mother had sat only hours before, wrists chained, dignity stripped by a system built to break her. Now he stood in her place, trembling but unbroken. He turned toward the screen still frozen on his mother's face. That image, caught mid-blink, was how the world saw her, a moment of weakness, edited to fit their narrative. But Malik saw more. He saw the truth hiding in plain sight. He pointed to the corner of the screen, where a faint reflection shimmered, a mirror on the far wall of the precinct, catching the outline of a clock. The time stamped on the footage said 7:42, but the reflection read 7:39, 3 minutes difference. 3 minutes that proved everything they said about her was false. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned forward, face tightening, voice cutting the silence like a blade. "That's inadmissible, this child." But the judge raised her hand again. Her voice was steady, controlled, but something new threaded through it, a tremor that wasn't fear. It was recognition. Let him continue. Malik's notebook lay open in his hand, pages filled with sketches, notes, and lines connecting time, sound, and shadows. He flipped to the one page he'd marked with a red thread. On it, drawings of the courthouse, the service corridor, and the freight elevator, each labeled with times and distances. He took a breath, small chest rising with courage too big for his frame. When they said my mom was at the crime scene, his voice cracked but didn't stop. She was still here, in this building. The hum you hear in the video, it's from this courthouse. The elevator alarm. The same beep, the prosecutor laughed, too loud, too sharp. Coincidence, Your Honor. That's conjecture, not evidence. But the boy wasn't finished. He turned toward the back door, the one the maintenance cart had been parked beside. I checked the cameras in the basement. Someone edited the timestamps before uploading them. Someone in this courthouse. A murmur rose. The maintenance worker shifted uneasily. The officer who'd been leaning on the wall tensed. The judge's eyes moved from Malik to the clerk, to the bailiff, then to the prosecutor. Something icy crawled down her spine. She'd heard whispers about evidence tampering before, but never dared to believe them. Malik reached for his bag and pulled out what looked like folded metal rods bound by straps. The bailiff moved instantly, hand hovering over his holster. But the judge's voice cracked through the tension like thunder. "Let him be." The boy unfolded the rods, connecting them with practiced precision. Springs clicked, hinges locked. The shape formed, a crude but functional exoskeleton, lightweight but strong, built from salvaged parts. Whispers turned to disbelief. Cameras flashed. Malik looked up at the judge, his voice soft, almost pleading. "You said you believe in truth, Your Honor. This is truth you can feel." For a moment, she didn't move. The weight of the robe, the wheelchair, the years of power and paralysis, all of it held her still. Then he wheeled toward her slowly, carefully, the device trembling in his hands. "You once said justice must stand on its own," he whispered, voice barely carrying over the storm. "So stand with it." The courtroom held its breath. She looked at the bailiff. He looked back uncertain. Finally, she nodded. He unlocked the wheelchair's brakes. The room tilted into disbelief as Malik adjusted the braces, locking them around her legs with straps. He tightened the supports near her knees, adjusted the frame against the chair. Her hands gripped the armrests. "This isn't possible," someone muttered. The boy met her eyes. "Neither is fairness in this place," he said softly. "But we make it possible," she tried once. Her muscles twitched. Nothing. Then again. Her arms pressed down, the springs in the frame hissed, the hinges creaked, and the courtroom fell silent. As she began to rise, it was clumsy, trembling, imperfect. But she rose. Gasps, cries, phones, dropped. The woman who had ruled from a chair for a decade now stood shaking, supported by the invention of the child whose mother stood accused beneath her authority. Every barrier, the physical, the racial, the institutional, fractured in that instant. Danielle, standing beside her chains, broke into tears. The room watched as the very system that had bound her became the stage for her child's miracle. The prosecutor's voice cracked. Desperate now. "Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation." "Silence," she commanded. But it wasn't the word. It was her voice. Strong, grounded, alive. For the first time in years, she looked at the courtroom not from below eye level, but across it. The view was different up here. She could see the smirks, the hesitation, the guilt. She could see the structure of power laid bare and ugly, and she could see the boy, his face wet, eyes fierce, with the quiet defiance of someone who refused to accept that justice should crawl when truth could walk. "I see you," she said, the words trembling. "All of you." "I've been seated too long." She looked at the prosecutor. "Play the footage again." The screen flickered. Malik pointed again. This time he slowed it frame by frame. The reflection, the light angle, the reverse timestamp. The evidence that didn't belong. Then, the faint outline of the officer's badge, identical to the one now sitting 2 rows behind the prosecutor. Whispers erupted into chaos. The maintenance worker stood abruptly. The officer lunged for the exit. The bailiffs moved, shouts slicing through the storm. Malik didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. The judge's voice boomed. "Stop him!" 2 officers grabbed the man, slamming him against the rail. Papers flew. A coffee cup shattered. The courtroom exploded into sound, justice finally roaring awake. When silence returned, it came heavy, unsteady. The judge, still standing, trembling but unyielding, turned toward the boy. "How long have you known?" she asked softly. "Since the day they took her," he said. "Since they said people like us always lie," the words hit harder than any gavel. She looked down, at her hands, her legs, the machine that made her stand, and then at the system that had made her sit for so long. In that moment, her robe didn't feel like authority. It felt like apology. The storm outside broke into sunlight, faint and gray but present. The boy turned to his mother. The chains around her wrists gleamed under the light. She smiled through tears, and then, without warning, a voice shouted from the gallery, "You staged this! You people always play the victim!" The crowd turned. A man in a suit, red-faced, pointing at Malik. "That device, this act, it's a trick. You don't belong here." Malik's jaw clenched. Before he could speak, the judge raised her hand again, but this time not in warning, in solidarity. "Enough," she said, her voice cracking like thunder. "This boy did what the rest of us refused to. He showed us how blind we've become." The man lowered his head. The judge turned back to the room, her voice trembling but fierce. "For years I've sat in this chair believing justice was a place. Today a child reminded me, it's a choice." She looked down at Malik, her eyes glassy. "And sometimes it takes someone small to lift the world back onto its feet." Applause rippled from the back row, soft at first, then growing. Not for the miracle, but for the truth it revealed. Malik didn't smile. He only looked at his mother as tears ran down her face. The bailiff stepped forward and, without instruction, unlocked her chains. The sound of the metal falling to the floor echoed like a bell. The prosecutor sat still, pale, wordless. For the first time, the burden of proof didn't belong to the defense. It belonged to the system itself. And yet, even as the truth stood tall in the center of that courtroom, Malik knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. Because truth in a world like this is not always enough. The judge looked down at him, still standing in her new fragile freedom. "What do you want, Malik?" she asked. He hesitated. "Just for people to stop laughing when we speak." The silence that followed was unbearable. Because everyone knew he wasn't just talking about this courtroom. He was talking about every classroom, every sidewalk, every workplace, every life. The judge's lips parted. She wanted to answer, but no words could carry the weight of centuries. Outside, the storm began to fade. The clouds split, light seeping through like forgiveness refusing to be denied. Danielle reached for her son. He stepped toward her, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish again. When their hands met, the room watched something that didn't belong to them. The judge exhaled, lowering herself back into the chair. Her legs trembled, the device clinking softly. She had stood long enough to feel the weight of truth and to realize she would never see justice the same way again. Malik closed his notebook, the final page still blank. Some stories, he thought, aren't written, they're lived. He turned to leave, his mother beside him, unchained but changed. And as they reached the door, A single question filled the air, unspoken but deafening. If a child can make justice stand, what excuse do the rest of us have for staying seated? The gavel fell one last time, echoing not as an ending, but as the sound of something beginning. The courtroom that once echoed with laughter was silent now. Not the silence of authority, but of reckoning, the kind that fills a room when truth finally arrives and refuses to leave. The storm outside had passed, but its scent lingered, wet and heavy, clinging to the marble walls and polished floors like memory. Malik and his mother stood together, their shadows stretching toward the bench where justice had, at last, found its feet. The gavel's final strike was not just the end of a case. It was the sound of a system shattering. If only for a moment, the world would write headlines about what had happened. Boy's invention makes paralyzed judge stand. Courtroom miracle shocks city. Justice on her feet again. But none of those words would capture the truth. Because what happened that day wasn't about science or spectacle. It was about something far deeper. A small boy forcing a nation to look in the mirror. When Danielle walked out of the courthouse, the chains that had once bound her wrists were gone, but the marks remained, faint bruises, reminders of how tightly the world had tried to hold her down. She lifted her wrists toward the light, not to show pain, but to show survival. Malik walked beside her, the crowd parting like a tide, unsure whether to cheer or to stare. Some reached out to touch him, to call him a hero. Others whispered words that still carried poison. But Malik didn't listen. He wasn't chasing glory. He was carrying something heavier, the weight of knowing how close his mother had come to disappearing forever. That night, their apartment was quiet again. No reporters, no cameras, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their tired feet. Malik sat by the window, his invention resting beside him, half dismantled now, pieces of aluminum glinting under the city light. His mother stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "You saved me," she whispered. He didn't look up. "No," he said softly. "I just made them see you." Outside, the world was already moving on. News scandals, new headlines. Justice, it seemed, had an expiration date. But not for Malik, not anymore. Because once you've watched the truth stand up, you can never unsee the way it changes everything around it. The next morning, news anchors debated whether what he'd done was real. Experts argued about authenticity, politics, and optics. Few talked about what really mattered, that a system built to protect had nearly destroyed an innocent life because of the color of her skin, and fewer still admitted the deeper truth. That the miracle wasn't that a judge stood, it was that a child refused to sit down. In the weeks that followed, the city tried to reclaim its balance. The officer and maintenance worker were arrested, the evidence tampering traced back to a web of corruption that reached farther than anyone wanted to believe. The prosecutor resigned quietly. The nursing home apologized publicly, and the judge, Judge Eleanor Watts, became something else entirely. She returned to the bench, but not as the same woman who once believed that justice was found in procedure. Her rulings grew longer, her questions sharper. When defendants stood before her, she didn't just see charges. She saw lives. She often thought of Malik, his eyes, his courage, the steadiness of his hands. The day he walked into her courtroom, he had done what years of law and policy had failed to do. He made justice human again, and though she could no longer stand without his invention, she kept it beside her bench, a silent reminder that truth does not always come from power. Sometimes it comes from pain, sometimes from innocence, but for Malik, the world didn't suddenly become fairer. At school, some teachers looked at him differently, half awe, half discomfort. Other kids whispered that he'd played the system. A few called him the miracle boy, while others muttered that he'd embarrassed the city. He learned that being right doesn't always make people kind. Yet he also saw something else, hope. A new kid in class, shy, brown-skinned, often teased, started walking home with him. The local paper ran a piece about young inventors, featuring him on the front page. A university engineering professor reached out, offering to mentor him. For the first time, Malik felt that maybe, just maybe, People were beginning to listen, but every time he looked at his mother, tired, quiet, still healing, he was reminded that listening isn't the same as changing. Danielle found work again, though it wasn't easy. Her record had been cleared, but suspicion lingered like an aftertaste. Customers still stared too long. Supervisors double-checked her receipts. She smiled through it all, but Malik saw the exhaustion beneath the surface. One evening, she came home late, rain dripping from her coat. She saw Malik at the table, sketching new designs, diagrams filled with equations and arrows. She smiled weakly. "Still building?" He nodded. "Trying to make it stronger. For people who can't stand on their own," she touched his cheek. "Just remember, baby, not everyone who can stand knows how to stand for what's right." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth lived in the quiet between them. Weeks turned to months. The case faded from the headlines, as all stories eventually do. But its echo lived on, in protests, in classrooms, in conversations whispered late at night between parents and their children. And one day, months later, Malik received a letter. It was from Judge Watts. Inside was a simple note. "The system taught me to look down. You taught me to look up. Keep building." Attached was a photo, her standing again, supported by his invention, addressing a classroom of law students. Behind her, on the chalkboard, were 4 words written in bold: "Justice must keep standing." Malik held the picture for a long time. He didn't cry. He just smiled, knowing that for once, justice wasn't sitting behind a desk. It was walking among people who needed to see it move. But stories like Malik's don't end neatly. They linger. They ripple outward, because while one courtroom found its courage, countless others still echoed with laughter at the expense of truth. For every Danielle freed, another mother somewhere still waits behind bars for a mistake she didn't make. For every judge who stands up, there are still many more who turn away. That's the part no headline will tell you, that justice doesn't fail all at once. It erodes slowly, case by case, smirk by smirk, until standing becomes an act of rebellion. And in that world, Malik's invention was more than metal and springs. It was a metaphor, a reminder that progress doesn't happen through miracles, but through defiance. Because racism isn't just violence in the street. It's laughter in a courtroom. It's the way people dismiss pain they don't feel. It's the way a system insists it's fair while it quietly tilts the scales. And Malik, a boy barely tall enough to reach the witness stand, had tilted them back. Months later, he returned to that courthouse. Not as a witness, not as a son defending his mother, but as a speaker, invited by Judge Watts to talk about truth. The same benches that once sneered at him were now filled with students, activists, lawyers, and journalists. Cameras rolled again, but this time for a different reason. He looked out over the crowd. Older now. More confident, his voice steady. "My mom used to say," he began, "that the truth doesn't shout, it waits. It waits for someone brave enough to speak it out loud." He paused, glancing toward the front row, where Danielle sat, smiling. "That day in court, I wasn't brave. I was scared. But I was tired of watching good people be broken because others couldn't see their worth. I didn't fix the system. I just showed it what it had forgotten." He looked toward Judge Watts. She nodded. "The truth isn't supposed to make people comfortable," Malik continued. "It's supposed to make them change." When he finished, the room stood in applause. But Malik didn't bask in it. He stepped down, hugged his mother, and whispered, "We stood." She smiled, tears glistening. "And now the world knows it can too." Outside the courthouse, the sky was a different kind of blue, the kind that comes after storms, clean and raw. Malik watched people walk past the building, their reflections caught in the glass. For the first time, he noticed something about that reflection. It wasn't perfect. It was rippled, distorted, but that's what truth looks like. Uneven, uncomfortable, real. He picked up a small piece of metal from his bag, the last unused part from his invention, and held it up to the sunlight. It shimmered, fragile but strong, a reminder that even broken pieces can build something powerful when put together with purpose. He slipped it into his pocket and whispered, "Still building." And so, the story that began with laughter ended with something far more powerful: silence. The kind of silence that makes people think, because maybe that's how change begins. Not with noise, not with anger, but with quiet moments where someone finally decides to see. Somewhere tonight, another courtroom is filled with eyes that look past the person on trial and see only their skin. Somewhere, another child is sitting by a window, wondering why fairness feels like a myth. Somewhere, another mother is whispering prayers into the dark, hoping someone will believe her. And somewhere, maybe, a boy like Malik is drawing again, designing not machines, but hope. Because injustice doesn't stop when the cameras turn away. It stops when people stop accepting it. It stops when the laughter dies, when truth stands, and when courage refuses to sit down. When Malik walked home that evening, he passed the old bus stop where he used to wait with his sister. The air smelled of rain and the pavement still shimmered with puddles. He looked at his reflection in the water, taller now, stronger. Behind him, his mother's shadow stretched beside his, equal at last. He thought about the people who had laughed that day and how silence had taught them more than punishment ever could. He thought about the judge, standing tall for the first time not as a symbol of power, but as a student of truth. And he thought about how racism hides in the quiet corners of ordinary life, in assumptions, in glances, in the way people choose who deserves to be believed. Maybe he couldn't erase all of that, but he could keep building. Machines, ideas, bridges, anything that helped people see one another again. He took a deep breath, the city lights flickering around him. The same streets that once made him feel small now felt like a map of possibilities. He whispered to himself, not as a vow, but as a truth already in motion. Justice isn't finished yet. It's still learning to stand. And maybe that's the message we all need to remember, that justice isn't a statue carved in stone, it's a living thing. It grows when people choose courage over comfort. It stands when someone refuses to kneel before lies. It breathes when truth finds a voice. So the next time we see injustice, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, a street, or a story, we have to ask ourselves, are we waiting for a miracle? Or are we ready to stand? Because sometimes standing up doesn't just change one life. It changes the world that thought it couldn't. This was Malik's story. But in a way, it's all of ours. The screen fades to black. A single line appears. Justice must keep standing. And for a moment, just long enough, you can feel it. The world, holding its breath, learning to stand again.